Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine for a moment you're trying to figure out the ground rules for a just society.
Hmm.
Not just what the rules are, but, how you even decide what counts as fair.
Right, the process.
Exactly. Should the principles of justice be totally neutral? Should they stand apart from everything people believe about what makes life good?
Or do they need to somehow tap into a shared understanding of what we value, who we are as a community?
Yeah, that's the foundational question, isn't it?
It really is. It gets right to the heart of whether justice can, or maybe even should, be completely separate from our deepest moral convictions,
Right.
our religious beliefs, our sense of, well, what makes a life worthwhile?
Exactly. And that core tension is what we're diving into today, based on some really potent ideas from Michael Sandel's book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice.
Mm-hmm.
Sandel is specifically pushing back against a certain very powerful strain of liberal thought.
Yeah.
The kind that prioritizes individual rights and tries very hard to define justice without appealing to any particular vision of the good life. Right. And our mission in this deep dive is to really grapple with Sandel's challenge to that whole idea.
Okay.
We want to explore why he thinks justice, well, can't be perfectly neutral, and what that means for things like who you are, what you might deserve, how society distributes resources,
Mm-hmm.
and even how we navigate those really tough, divisive political issues.
Okay, so let's start with that central conflict he identifies.
Yeah.
The priority of the right over the good.
Yeah.
It's not really a debate about whether rights are important. I think everyone involved here agrees they are crucial.
Sure, sure. The question is more, can you actually identify and justify those rights, those principles of justice, without leaning on some idea of what a good life or a good society looks like?
Exactly. The kind of liberalism Sandel is analyzing, often linked to thinkers like John Rawls, basically says yes. It argues the right comes first.
Mm-hmm.
The principles of justice should be these neutral frameworks. They set the fair rules of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And then within that, individuals are free to pursue their own definition of the good life.
Okay. And Sandel's counterargument.
It's fascinating, really. He says justice can't be this freestanding, neutral thing. He believes recognizing certain rights, certain principles of justice, often depends on showing they're already kind of woven into the shared understandings,
Uh-huh.
the traditions, the common life of the community. For him, arguments about justice or rights often look less like discovering some universal neutral truth,
Right.
and more like calling a community to remember, or maybe reaffirm, its own implicit ideals. It's about recalling a community to itself.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. Because that liberal idea, the priority of the right, seems to require a very specific picture of the person, of who you are, fundamentally.
It absolutely does. It leads to what Sandel calls the unencumbered self.
The unencumbered self. Okay.
Yeah. This is the idea that your fundamental identity exists before or separate from your goals, your values, your loyalties, your community ties.
So those are things you have, maybe, but they don't make you who you are.
Precisely. They don't constitute who you fundamentally are.
Yeah.
You exist prior to them.
And I guess the power behind that idea, maybe tracing back to Kant, is that your dignity comes from your capacity to choose your ends freely.
That's the core of it, yeah.
It's that ability to stand back and, pick your religion, your values, your life plan. That's what makes you a subject, not just an object defined by whatever desires happen to be swirling around.
Exactly. Respect is for that capacity to choose, for the choosing self. It's not strictly for the specific beliefs or values you end up picking.
Interesting. So the content is less important than the act of choosing itself.
In this view, yes. Agency, your ability to act in the world is seen as very voluntaristic.
Voluntarist.
Meaning
Meaning you choose your ends almost like picking items off a shelf. As a willing subject chooses objects.
Okay.
Your relationship to them is sort of detached. You possess them, but they aren't deeply embedded in your identity. You hold them externally. And part of the appeal of this picture, I suppose, is that it seems to sidestep those huge, difficult philosophical debates about human nature or what the best life actually is.
Right. It suggests you don't need to settle the big questions to agree on the rules of justice. Let's find neutral ground.
But Sandel really challenges whether that unencumbered self actually rings true. Like, is that how we really experience our lives?
He argues it's deeply problematic.
Yeah.
He proposes instead the encumbered self.
Encumbered, okay.
On this view, who you are is partly shaped, partly constituted by your ends, your values, your attachments, family, community, history, tradition.
So these aren't just external possessions you picked up?
No, They are part of your identity. They make you who you are, at least in part.
So agency then isn't just about picking things off the shelf. It involves a deeper kind of reflection, doesn't it?
Exactly. It's more cognitive. It's about figuring out, among all the possibilities, what truly belongs to me, what fits with who I understand myself to be,
So it's a process of discovering and clarifying your identity.
right? Forging an identity by clarifying its bounds, not just applying a pre-existing self to a menu of choices.
So you can contrast that voluntarist agency, just choosing what ends to pick, with this more cognitive agency, reflecting on who I am to figure out what ends are suitable for me.
Precisely. And the critique is that the unencumbered self's agency seems a bit limited.
Yeah.
Maybe just sorting through existing preferences, not that richer process of self-discovery or evaluating the worth of values themselves.
And I think Sandel's point, if I'm getting it, is that this self, supposedly liberated by being stripped of all these attachments, might actually be less empowered, maybe even thin is the word he uses.
Yeah, thin, disempowered even. If your identity is defined by nothing you actually deeply care about or are attached to, what's left to act from? What gives your choices weight?
Right. Okay. This has huge implications then when we talk about distributive justice, how society distributes goods, who gets what.
Absolutely. If you're just this unencumbered self,
Right.
what's the basis for saying you deserve anything in a really fundamental way?
Yeah, because this liberal view, again, thinking of Rawls and maybe Dworkin, often rejects the whole idea of moral desert as the basis for distribution.
Exactly. They argue you don't deserve your natural talents, your intelligence, your looks, your physical abilities. You don't even really deserve your capacity for hard work or the supportive environment you might have grown up in.
Why not?
Because from a moral standpoint, these things are arbitrary. They're a matter of luck in the natural lottery or the social lottery.
Okay. Which leads to that often controversial idea that natural assets can be seen as common assets.
Common assets. Not individually owned in a strong, deserved sense, but perhaps a pool that society can arrange and draw upon for collective benefit. Maybe structured by principles aiming to benefit the least well-off, for instance.
And there's a crucial distinction they make here between entitlement and desert.
Yes, that's key. You might be entitled to something if you meet the rules of an existing institution. You have legitimate expectations based on the system.
Like getting paid for doing a job according to your contract.
Right. But you don't fundamentally deserve that job or the talents that got you there in some deeper moral sense. On this view, you're more like a temporary guardian or repository of your talents, not their inherent rightful owner in a strong sense.
And Sandel raises the obvious, maybe slightly uncomfortable question that hangs over this.
Which is?
If individuals don't really own these assets in that deep sense, who does? Does society as a whole somehow own them?
Right. He pushes back on the idea of this abstract entity, society, having a superior claim over individuals, especially if society is just, well, a collection of individuals. Who is this society that owns my talents?
You can really see how this plays out in practice with something as contested as affirmative action.
Absolutely. Dworkin, for instance, uses this kind of framework to defend affirmative action. He argues merit isn't some fixed inherent quality you possess.
Okay.
It's defined by what society needs at a given time for its collective goals. So, for example, having a black skin might count as merit for a doctor intending to serve a specific underserved black community.
Not because of inherent worth, but because it helps fulfill a needed social purpose.
Exactly. Admissions to university, on this view, are less about rewarding past achievement or inherent desert, and more like incentives to guide talented people towards socially useful roles.
And I think where Sandel really connects with our intuition here, or at least our unease, is highlighting the moral discomfort this can cause. Even if you sort of grant the point that talents are arbitrary from a moral view, he uses that powerful thought experiment, doesn't he? The hypothetical rejection or acceptance letters based on this logic.
Yeah, essentially telling someone, sorry, we're rejecting you because you don't happen to have the traits society currently finds most useful. Or conversely, congratulations, we're accepting you because you possess these traits that society can now utilize for its benefit.
It feels kind of transactional, doesn't it? Almost instrumentalizing.
It does. It seems to treat individuals less like whole persons with their own sense of self and worth, and more like temporary vessels for useful attributes that can be deployed for some collective goal.
It seems to deny that stronger sense of identity and maybe ownership over one's life and talents that many people intuitively feel. It's jarring.
It is. And this connects to another layer Sandel explores.
Yeah.
Under what conditions is justice even the primary virtue we should be striving for.
Ah, right. Rawls, following the philosopher David Hume, talks about the circumstances of justice.
Exactly. Those are typically described as, well, first, conditions of moderate scarcity. So not extreme poverty where life is just a desperate struggle, but also not overflowing abundance where there's enough for everyone easily.
Okay, moderate scarcity. And second,
And second, a population of individuals who are, let's say, mutually disinterested.
meaning they're selfish.
Not necessarily purely selfish, but they primarily care about their own interests and goals, even if they're reasonable and willing to cooperate on fair terms. They have conflicting claims on those moderately scarce resources.
So in that environment, conflicting claims, limited resources, people looking out for number one justice is necessary to ensure fair distribution and cooperation.
That's the idea. But the challenge Sandel explores is, what if those circumstances didn't exist?
Like if there was incredible abundance
Or widespread genuine benevolence and altruism, if people deeply cared about each other's well-being. Hume himself suggested that justice wouldn't really be needed then.
what would take its place?
Other, perhaps nobler virtues, as Hume put it, things like generosity, fraternity, solidarity, love.
So this calls into question whether justice is always the first virtue of social institutions, as Rawls famously stated.
Exactly. Sandel points out that justice might be primary specifically for societies marked by a certain level of discord, conflicting interests, and maybe a lack of strong shared identity or common purpose.
He uses the example of a family, doesn't he?
Yes. In a close, loving family, if you suddenly started interacting with your siblings purely based on strict principles of justice,
Yeah.
I did the dishes last time, it's precisely your turn. Keeping score meticulously.
Yeah, that would feel wrong. Cold.
It could feel like a breakdown of the relationship, couldn't it? It might seem like a vice rather than a virtue in that context. It transforms a situation that should be governed by affection or fraternity into one of calculation and competing claims.
So the importance of justice might be conditional. It depends on the social context, rather than being some absolute, universal top requirement in all situations.
That's the implication. And if justice's importance can be conditional, how do these liberal principles of justice get justified in the first place? Where do they come from?
Well, a classic liberal move, probably the most famous one, is the hypothetical contract, thinking about Rawls' original position behind the veil of ignorance.
The thought experiment.
The idea is that principles of justice are fair if they would be chosen by parties who are rational and self-interested. But crucially, they're behind this veil. They're ignorant of their own social status, their natural talents, their race, their gender, and even their personal vision of the good life.
Right. The veil strips away information that could lead to biased choices. The goal is pure procedural justice.
Meaning the outcome the principles chosen is considered just simply because the procedure for choosing them was fair.
Exactly. It's a form of voluntarist justification. The principles are valid because they would be hypothetically agreed upon, chosen, under these idealized fair conditions.
But the critique here, and Sandel makes it, is that, well, hypothetical agreements don't actually bind anyone in the real world, do they? I didn't actually agree to this.
Right. And even with actual contracts, we don't think they're self-justifying. We always ask, but was the contract itself fair? Were the conditions fair? You can't justify fairness just by saying we agreed.
Good point.
And Sandel argues that the original position, despite its aim to strip away contingent factors and ensure impartiality, isn't really a true choice or agreement in the voluntarist sense.
What is it then?
He suggests it's more like a carefully constructed thought experiment that reveals or discovers principles that are already implicit in the starting assumptions.
Assumptions like?
Particularly that thin, unencumbered conception of the self that's assumed for the parties behind the veil. They are imagined as these detached choosers. So it doesn't really escape relying on a specific and potentially problematic view of the person after all. It's less a contract, more a kind of self-discovery based on those premises.
Okay, let's try and bring this back to the messy reality of politics. How does this kind of liberal approach try to handle deep disagreements in public life? Because we certainly have those.
Yeah. Well, in his later work, Rawls developed the idea of political liberalism. He was trying to address how diverse societies, with citizens holding fundamentally conflicting moral and religious views, could still maintain stability and legitimacy.
Okay, Tao.
The idea is to find an overlapping consensus, to identify political principles of justice that reasonable people holding different comprehensive doctrines, different overall views of life, could nevertheless agree on for political purposes.
So trying to find common ground just for the sake of structuring political life without everyone having to agree on religion or morality.
Exactly. The aim is for public reason, the way we justify laws and policies in public, to try and be neutral on these deeply divisive moral and religious issues. Rawls spoke of applying the principle of toleration to philosophy itself, trying to sort of bracket those deep questions in political debate.
Bracket them, set them aside for political purposes. Sandel uses a historical example to really probe this idea, doesn't he? The Lincoln-Douglas debates.
He does, from 1858. Stephen Douglas was advocating for popular sovereignty regarding slavery, basically. Let the settlers in each territory decide for themselves whether to allow slavery or not.
And Douglas claimed this was the neutral position, right?
Yes, he explicitly said he didn't care if slavery was voted up or down. He presented it as respecting local choice, avoiding a national moral judgment.
But Lincoln's response?
Lincoln's response was incredibly powerful, and Sandel argues it points to the real limits of this kind of neutrality or bracketing. Lincoln basically said you can't be neutral on a fundamental wrong like slavery. Because trying to bracket the morality of slavery, pretending it's just a matter of local preference, itself implies an implicit judgment. It implies that slavery is not a grave moral wrong, that it's the kind of issue that can be legitimately decided by majority vote or local option.
Ah, so the act of bracketing isn't neutral. It makes its own statement about the issue's moral weight.
Precisely. Lincoln argued it was unreasonable, even morally obtuse, to stop talking about the very thing that everyone knew was the central moral question dividing the nation. You can't just wish it away by declaring neutrality.
And Sandel connects this directly to modern debates, like abortion or, say, same-sex marriage.
Yes. He suggests that trying to bracket the moral status of the fetus in the abortion debate, aiming for neutrality, often implicitly relies on a view where the fetus does not have the moral status of a person. Similarly, bracketing the morality of homosexual conduct often relies on an implicit judgment that it is morally permissible, or at least not the state's business.
So Sandel isn't necessarily taking a side on these specific issues in this context, but he's arguing that the attempt to be neutral by avoiding the core moral question is often illusory.
Exactly. You end up making an implicit moral judgment by the very act of trying to avoid making one publicly. The neutrality is not truly neutral.
And this also raises tricky questions about where you draw the lines. What counts as a reasonable disagreement that public reason must accommodate by bracketing versus a disagreement where the state can take a side?
Right. Rawls, for instance, suggests that deep disagreements about comprehensive moral or religious doctrines are a permanent fact of reasonable pluralism that liberalism must respect.
Okay.
But he seems to suggest that disagreements about the principles of justice themselves, say, between his own liberal egalitarian view and a libertarian view, are not part of that reasonable pluralism in the same way. His theory of justice can still be enacted by the state.
Which leads to Sandel's challenge. Okay, why is it legitimate for the state to enact a Rawlsian vision of, say, redistributive justice, using state power against libertarians who fundamentally disagree with that vision, but it's not legitimate for the state to enact laws based on certain widely held moral views, perhaps about family or sexuality, simply because some other reasonable people disagree?
It forces you to ask, on what basis are we deciding which disagreements must be bracketed and which ones allow the state to take a stand? It makes you wonder if this liberal public reason, while aiming for neutrality, ends up being quite restrictive, as Sandel puts it. It might privilege certain kinds of arguments, secular rights-based, while excluding others based on religious or comprehensive moral views from the political sphere.
Okay, so let's try to quickly bring together some of Sandel's main points of critique against this particular influential strand of liberalism that he's examining. First, he challenges the idea of the unencumbered self. He finds it too detached, too thin, maybe unable to fully account for our actual experience of identity as being shaped by our values and attachments.
Right. Second, he questions whether justice is truly the first or overriding virtue in all circumstances. He suggests its priority might be conditional, depending on specific social conditions, like the presence of discord or lack of strong community bonds.
Third, he argues that justifying justice through purely hypothetical contracts, like the veil of ignorance, isn't really a genuine choice or agreement, and it actually relies on the very same, potentially problematic, thin conception of the self it seeks to avoid depending on.
That's a key critique. And finally,
he powerfully suggests that in our actual political lives, attempting to bracket grave moral questions to achieve neutrality is often impossible, and maybe even undesirable. because it forces us to make implicit moral judgments anyway, and it might prevent us from engaging with the real substance of our disagreements.
Yeah, those are the core threads, I think. Ultimately, Sandel's work is really a profound invitation for us to reconsider whether principles of justice can ever truly exist independent of our shared understandings, however contested, of the good life and the communities and traditions that shape who we are.
So what does this all mean for you, listening to this? Sandel really makes us ask, are we primarily independent, choosing selves fundamentally separate from our ends?
Or are our identities actually shaped, maybe even constituted,
Yeah.
by loyalties, relationships, values, communities that we didn't necessarily choose but find ourselves embedded within?
And if our identities are partly defined by those things, those encumbrances, what happens to the ideal of a perfectly neutral justice?
Yeah. Does being just require us to ignore or try to rise above those attachments? Or does it sometimes require us to find ways to navigate them publicly, perhaps even making difficult substantive judgments about competing visions of the good life?
Okay, here's a final provocative thought, something to mull over. If justice does need to draw on shared understandings of the good life, or the kind of people we aspire to be, how on earth do we figure out what those shared understandings are in a society as incredibly diverse and pluralistic as ours?
And maybe even more challenging, who gets to decide? These are complex questions, definitely ones that stay with you long after closing Sandel's book or, well, finishing this deep dive.